And joining us now in studio, Chris Hedges, author with Joe Sacco of Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. Welcome back to the agenda.
Thanks.
I have to say, when I first picked up your book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, kind of thought, you know, end of the world movie, Hollywood blockbuster. But when I read it, it is sort of a story about the end of the world as we know it, isn't it?
Yes, and what we're watching is not just the assault against the ecosystem, but the collapse of globalization. And both of those two events have profound consequences, which I think are now beginning to ripple across the globe.
You talk about in your book, it's focused on what you call sacrifice zones.
Right.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, they are the places where corporations were able to walk in, and we begin with Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and westward expansion and the railroad companies, and focus on Pine Ridge, which is one of the poorest pockets of the United States, as are all the pockets we talk about. The average life expectancy in Pine Ridge is 48 for a male. It's the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti at any one time on Pine Ridge, which is, of course, a reservation for Native Americans. 60% of the population lives without electricity or running water. This is the United States. And these sacrifice zones have just been ripped apart. The consequences to the environment, to families, to communities, all has been prostrated before the demands of the marketplace. And what's happened in places like Pine Ridge and Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States, in the coal fields of southern West Virginia, in the produce fields, where you have undocumented workers whose conditions, work conditions, often resemble slavery, quite literally, is that this exploitation has, which has cannibalized these areas, is now leaching outwards across the country.
So let's talk about Camden, New Jersey. It was at once a manufacturing hub. Campbell's was there, I think. Paint a picture of Camden in its golden age.
Well, Camden, because it sits on the Delaware River across from Philadelphia, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, was a very vital manufacturing center. RCA used to be there. You had Campbell's soup was made there. You had a huge port which employed shipyards, which employed 36,000 people. Porcelain, I mean, all sorts of stuff was made there.
And now?
Nothing. It's a completely dead city. And that's why it's such a dramatic example. In other industrial centers, you have, parts, often large parts of the city that has decayed. In Camden, everything went. It is a city that produces nothing other than crime, drugs, and poverty. Roughly 100 open-air drug markets. It's not only per capita the poorest city, but it always ranks 1 or 2 as the most dangerous city in the United States.
I'm wondering, you have traveled so many places around this world. I mean, seeing poverty is really no stranger to you. And you said, this is in the United States, but when you set foot in Camden, I mean, were you shocked beyond what even your expectations might have been?
Well, I've been in the poorest cities in the United States, Detroit, East New York, but I was unprepared for the extent of the decay in Camden, where you have whole city blocks abandoned, trees growing out of roofs, the public library abandoned. It was post-apocalyptic. There's no place quite like it in the United States because there's nothing there. There's not even a supermarket. You have a supermarket on the edge of Camden, but in the center of Camden, because the crime is so bad.
How many folks are there?
Camden probably now has a population of about 70,000, roughly.
And they got no supermarket, one on the edge of town.
Well, it's all processed food. I mean, we saw the same thing in places like southern West Virginia or even Pine Ridge. It's all fat and sugar. So you have, Crown Fried Chicken and donut shops. That's replicated. I mean, in these sacrifice zones, they're food deserts because of the way agribusiness is set up and the cost of importing fruits and vegetables from California or Florida, especially with rising fuel prices, prices out the poor. And so they don't get it. It's not sold to them.
So you have Camden in the golden age, Camden of today. Are you suggesting that we restart Camden's manufacturing base to get it back to a place where it's prosperous?
I think it's too late for that. Manufacturing has, well, first it went over the border to Mexico, and now we see large-scale factory closures as people pack up and leave for the cut-rate embrace of China's totalitarian capitalism or Bangladesh. And with the rise of sort of a global neo-feudalism, workers everywhere are told that they have to be competitive with sweatshop labor that makes 22 cents an hour or prison labor in China. I mean, that's really the message that's being delivered. And one of the sort of heartbreaking aspects of going into a place like Camden is that quite literally the guts of the city are being shipped out. I mean, one of the few functioning businesses in Camden, aside from drugs, are the scrap yards. As soon as a house is empty, even if it's just being repainted, thieves will break in and take all the piping, anything that's metal, including the screen doors, take them down, and then you have ships from China, Turkey, Pakistan hauling this stuff off and smelting it down. There's a kind of self-devouring quality to these places in their kind of twilight existence.
It's a grim picture, obviously. What are the people there, though, sacrificing?
It's not what they're sacrificing, it's that they have been sacrificed. The people in these sacrifice zones have been destroyed. If there were two kind of common threads in every place that we worked out of, it was one, the power of religion, and of course on Pine Ridge, that was Native American tradition, sweat lodges, the Sundance. I mean, that really was the only thing holding people together, which, by the way, is something I saw in the Middle East, in places like Gaza. If you're trapped in the open-air prison that is Gaza, and you have no employment, and you're sleeping 10 to a room, and you can't get married because you don't have a job, the one thing that gives structure to your life is praying 5 times a day and going to the mosque. And that was true in all of the places. For instance, the undocumented workers, primarily from Mexico and Central America, devoutly religious, those who managed to sort of build some kind of protection from the outside world. And then the rest fall into dramatic substance abuse. In southern West Virginia, it's primarily prescription medicine, Oxycontin, they call it hillbilly heroin. But we would walk into these old coal camps in West Virginia, and it was as if you were interviewing zombies. People were so zonked out on these opiates. And it's how you cope with that kind of pain, that despair, that loss of a future, that violence. We sort of went right down to the bottom to look at factors that are going to begin to affect wider and wider segments of the population in the industrialized world.
I know your in-laws live in Scarborough, and I don't know, have you ever been to Port McNicoll, Ontario?
I have not.
Okay, well, Port McNicoll, Ontario is a waterfront town, much like Camden is. Decades ago hailed as Chicago of the North, and now the town suffers from deterioration. So I'm wondering, is the Camdens of the U.S., is that a U.S. phenomenon as you see it, or is this a global phenomenon?
I wouldn't call it a global phenomenon. I would call it a phenomena of the industrialized world. As the industrialized nations have essentially allowed, and the United States is probably the most advanced, has allowed their manufacturing to be gutted and shipped overseas. I mean, we had cases where factories in the United States and places like Ohio were literally crated, packed and crated and shipped abroad. And then the rise of industrial centers in places like China that begins to resemble the kind of horror shows that we saw in Victorian England, where workers work until exhaustion. When companies don't make enough profits, we see this in China in these overcrowded dormitories, and wages aren't paid. People will climb up at the end of the month to roofs and jump off and commit suicide. No protection for workers, no kind of basic safety conditions, no environmental protections. I mean, people sort of exposed to toxic substances. That's what's being recreated. And so when we talk about neo-feudalism, that's really what we're saying. It's a world where all of the advances that were made by labor unions within the industrialized world are eradicated because the manufacturing class is completely stripped of all of their rights in places like Vietnam or China or elsewhere.
Okay, so jobs go overseas. How do you bring jobs back to a place like Camden?
I don't know that places like Camden are going to recover, partly because the infrastructure itself is so decayed and destroyed, and because the population itself, remember you're talking 2-3 generations of severe poverty, and the consequences of that psychologically, emotionally, physically are devastating. The educational system in places like Camden virtually don't function. The dropout rate is staggering, the illiteracy rate is staggering. It's extremely hard to resurrect a place like that. And the same is true in Pine Ridge, where you have an estimated 80% of the population are alcoholics. When people are reduced to that level of deprivation, they're broken in every way possible. And I don't know that in any of these sacrifice zones it's going to be possible to come back. In southern West Virginia, we're watching the coal companies blast the tops off of the mountains, the top 400 feet off of mountains to get at coal seams. It's called mountaintop removal. Well, I mean, this is poisoning the air, poisoning the water. Cancer is an epidemic in the region. We went into small towns where everybody, including the children, had their gallbladders removed. The water itself is fetid. It's hard to get your head around. We flew over the Appalachian and the willful destruction of the Appalachian Mountains, which are one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world, and of course the lungs of the eastern seaboard. It's where the headwaters of so much of the eastern seaboard's water comes from. It's all being poisoned and destroyed for short-term profit.
So there's this great outward migration out of these sacrifice zones for the most part. But you wrote about a guy in Camden, Joe Balzano,
Right.
octogenarian, 75, 70, I can't remember
Right.
how old he was. But he's one of the white residents who actually chose to stay. Why does he stay?
Well, he runs the port, so that the port, while it doesn't build ships anymore, is still functional. And he was useful in the sense that he could reconstruct the old Camden. He grew up in Camden as a boy, and he took us around Camden. So we're driving down these deserted streets, and he's talking about where this ice cream parlor was, or that movie theater was, or where his aunt lived. And it was a sense, I mean, we could look at old photographs, but it gave us a sense of what was there and what had been lost. And he became, and Joe drew him out in comic panels, but it became a way to visually give the reader a sense of what was there and what's there now.
You've done that in war zones. You've gone around and seen people have taken you around and said, this is, this was with this, and now look at it, it's a bombed out building
Right.
and stuff. Similar.
Right. Well, when we were in Bosnia, we would fly over Bosnia in helicopters, and you would just see town after town that was sort of dynamited into rubble by the Serbs. When we were in southern West Virginia, and Joe and I were in Bosnia together, it reminded us exactly of that same kind of landscape, where abandoned houses had eventually been set on fire. All you had were spindly chimneys and charred embers in row after row after row after row. The destruction of poverty. It's a good example of how the destruction of poverty can replicate almost exactly the destruction of war.
We can't really talk about the changes in the United States without talking about race. And there's another woman in Camden named Lolly, an African-American woman. To what extent is the deterioration of places like Camden exacerbated by racial tensions in your country?
Well, race is an issue that has plagued the United States since its founding. And the subjugation of African Americans is something that has been kept in place after slavery through convict leasing, Jim Crow laws. Both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X talked extensively about the impossibility of having racial justice until you had economic justice, when all of the routes out of poverty are cut, are blocked. then you keep your underclass in places like Camden, and Camden is almost exclusively African American and Hispanic. You keep these people trapped. You keep them trapped through a dysfunctional educational system, the fact that they can't get credit, mortgages, loans, the fact that they can't get jobs, and of course, let's not forget the prison system. Almost everyone we interviewed in Camden, of the men, had spent time in prison.
But the thing that's interesting is Lolly, and the story you tell about, I mean, she doesn't really feel trapped, does she?
Yeah, Lolly comes out of that amazing tradition of these incredibly strong African American women who are sort of forces of nature, and somehow, although they have a very realistic appraisal of what's happening around them, find this strength to hold people together. And the story of Lolly is that she not only raised her own children, but raised innumerable children who didn't have a mother.
And she's also very religious.
And deeply religious. And I think that's not coincidental.
So on the one hand, we have the Lollys and the Joe Balzanos. On the other hand, you write about a guy called George E. Norcross III. Tell me about him.
Well, George E. Norcross III is one of the most powerful political figures in the state of New Jersey, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he is the undisputed overlord of Camden, although he's white and although he does not live in Camden. You can't get elected to office, you can't get a job unless you go through Norcross. He is the boss of sort of southern New Jersey, and we know that he uses very brutal tactics to maintain control because he was taped. Nothing ever came of it. Some of those tapes, wiretaps, which were ostensibly going to be used in a case against him, were leaked to the press, and it's not language I can recite on mainstream television, but it's in the book. And you get a window. It's a window into how these people operate.
Well, I want you to tell me more about it because it's a Palmyra, New Jersey councilman records some of Norcross's control methods. Right.
Well, he goes on because he's pressured by Norcross, so the Attorney General's office sets up a sting operation. They record it, and then Norcross, because of his political clout, I expect, is never prosecuted. Most of the tapes have never been released to the public. A small, I think about 90 minutes or something, have been released. But it's enough to get a sense of how figures like Norcross work. And there are Ollie L. Sloan, a former councilman who ends up going to prison. He believes he was set up by Norcross, calls him the pimp of poverty. There are these figures for whom poverty can be a very good business. And Norcross is just, I think, one of many examples where those who are completely disempowered are preyed upon.
Are we seeing this by George E. Norcross just in New Jersey, or are there others like him, on a national scale?
No, I think Norcross is just emblematic of corporate power and where it lies, and how there is no impediment to corporate power, that these people are allowed to exploit and profit in ways that are not only against the common good, but I think are also questionable legally.
You make the connection in your book, it's one of the themes between the correlation between physical deterioration of a city and the subsequent moral breakdown. And I want to push you a bit on this because there are prosperous cities like Toronto, for example, that, albeit in very rare occasions, like if I think of the G20, that we have seen instances of police brutality. So how does corruption in a place like Camden differ from what I think most people would agree that the leaders and their institutions might have a degree of, or accuse them of having a degree of corruption?
Well, just statistically, I guess in the last 2 decades, I think you've had 3 Camden mayors go to prison. The mayor that we interviewed when we were doing the book, her first job when she took office was cleaning up after the FBI had ransacked it and hauling off her predecessor. When societies like this break down, then you inevitably create a small parasitic elite that essentially plunders what's left. That's been true in Camden, but it was also true in Pine Ridge, certainly true in southern West Virginia. The coal companies own every politician, from the local city council member right up to the U.S. senator. You cannot defy, Massey Energy, Massey Coal, and survive politically. So when you go into these places where people are disempowered, and they don't have either institutional mechanisms or social organizations to fight back, then, on a certain level, they become enslaved. These corporations are able to carry out policies that literally make life almost unendurable, unbearable, and there's no one to stop them. And I think that's one of the fundamental messages of the book, that if we don't stand up to unfettered, unregulated capitalism, corporate capitalism, which, as Karl Marx correctly pointed out, is a revolutionary force, then the fate of those within these sacrifice zones will be the fate of many of us.
Okay, but I bet if I called up the mayor of Camden today or any previous mayors in the last decade, they're going to say, you know what, there has been an effort to improve things. And I think it's something called the Municipal Rehabilitation and Economic Recovery Act of 2002. Is what they say. That's really good. It's promoted as a way to create jobs, to improve quality of life, to reduce crime. So they're going to say to me, well, Hedges might be telling you one thing, but we're doing things to fix this problem.
Well,
Is there any evidence
that was a state
worked?
initiative which didn't create jobs. It went to pet projects of George Norcross, including Cooper Hospital, which is a huge medical complex in Camden that's almost a kind of city within a city. It went to refurbish a waterfront aquarium that's used by tourists outside the city. As Ollie L. Sloan said, $30 million for the fish of Camden, while we have, tainted and contaminated water coming out of our pipes. So there was money, but it's a perfect example of how that money was siphoned off and enriched the elites and the projects of the elites, rather than affecting the average citizen. And even interestingly enough, even figures like Norcross have admitted that it had very little effect within the neighborhood.
Are tourists really going to Camden?
Well, they'll go to the aquarium is down on the river, so it's within the city limits of Camden, but that whole area around the aquarium has been leveled so that you don't actually get in close proximity to any actual residents in Camden.
Okay, I want to juxtapose what we're seeing in a place like Camden with another manufacturing city, Pittsburgh. So take a look at these numbers. These are the peak unemployment rates for both Camden and Pittsburgh once manufacturing collapsed late 70s, early 80s. So in Camden, New Jersey, in 1980, peak unemployment 17.9%, 2012, 19.5%. Pittsburgh, 1983 at the peak, 17.1, 2012, 7.7%. You agree with those numbers as I laid them out for you there?
Well, you have to remember that a lot of people in places like Camden, I can't speak for Pittsburgh because I haven't reported out of there, are no longer counted in the census. They're completely, because it's third or fourth generation poverty, they're not even on the official rolls anymore. The unemployment figures in Camden are ones of some dispute as to what the actual unemployment is. And remember that in the United States, there are all sorts of mechanisms to erase people from the unemployment rolls, so that if you stop looking for work after a certain period of time, you no longer are counted as unemployed if you are working at a poorly paid part-time job. And most workers at places like Walmart in the United States work about 28 hours a week. Although their wages put them below the poverty line, they're counted as employed. So the actual figures of unemployment, both within places like Camden and nationally, are far greater, as some newspapers like the LA Times have pointed out, than is officially put out.
Okay, but the point is that Pittsburgh seems to have turned the tide at any rate. So why can't more Rust Belt cities do what Pittsburgh has done?
Well, in Pittsburgh, and my understanding of Pittsburgh is that its primary employees are universities and medical centers. The manufacturing base, especially the steel mills, have been gutted and destroyed. I believe there's also been a population decline in Pittsburgh. And I've been to Pittsburgh. I was there for the G20. I don't think we can credit any of these cities with a revival as such, because what we have allowed to happen since the 1970s, and it was accelerated under Clinton with the North American Free Trade Agreement, is the dismantling of our manufacturing base. And there may be jobs in the service sector, flipping hamburgers, working at a gas station, working at Walmart, but these are not comparable to the kinds of jobs a unionized steel worker would have had in Pittsburgh, where they were making $50 an hour, where they had a pension, where they had medical benefits, where on their salary they could support a small family, maybe even buy a small house, send their kids to college. Those jobs are gone, and those jobs are not coming back.
And thanks for joining us tonight, Chris, and we'll hear more from you tomorrow night. I'm Piya Chattopadhyay. Thank you for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And here's a preview of what's coming up tomorrow night on our program. We'll see you then.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.